Hey, friends from around the world. I'm so happy to be here in this new show named Dapr in Action, again in C Sharp Live, C Sharp TV Live. And my name is Rodrigo Díaz Concha. I'm a Microsoft Regional Director. And I've been working with .NET technologies since 21 years ago, 20, no, more than 22 years, I guess. And in this show, we're going to see Dapr as a framework for building distributed applications. And of course, I'm going to use .NET most of the time, but of course, you can use the same knowledge with other programming languages such as Python or Rust or I don't know, what have you, whatever floats your boat. Okay, because Dapr is open source and is technology agnostic, and we're going to have a great time. Last year, we had a blast teaching the Kubernetes fundamentals here in CSharpCorner. And I actually went to New Delhi on October 2023, and I had a blast over there, met a lot of people, great community. And I'm so happy to be here again with you, friends, in C Sharp Corner Live, also known as C Sharp TV. Okay, so let's get into it, shall we? Dapr in Action, weekly series about Dapr. I'm your host. I'm going to teach you Dapr. It's going to be a 12-ish week-long show, okay? Maybe 12, maybe 11, maybe 13. Who knows? Maybe 14. Who knows? Because Dapr is so huge now. There's a lot of building blocks that we can use for creating fabulous distributed applications so easily. And of course, I need enough time to show you all the different building blocks. And that's why I'm calculating 12 weeks for doing this, okay? It's going to be a Monday show. For instance, here at home is 10 a.m. in the morning. So that's Central Time. And this is in Eastern Time is 11 a.m., I guess, right now. And in India, Standard Time is 9:30 p.m. If you feel that this is confusing, don't worry, it is. Time zones are so weird, right? That's why I went to worldtimebody.com and I added the different cities and time zones. And this is the place and time where we're going to spend our time together, okay? So today is session number 1, but before I jump into the topics, let me explain to you what you should know to get the most out of this course, okay? You should know cloud native application basics, such as what's the cloud, cloud computing basic concepts, and distributed applications basic concepts. I'm sorry. And I'm choking. Parenthesis, right? I'm choking. You may be see me sneezing and coughing all the time. Maybe today, maybe next week as well. I hope only 1 week or 2 because I'm kind of under the weather. Anyway, let's go back to the what you should know topics. Object-oriented programming. I'm going to use .NET and the C# programming language, and sometimes I'm going to use Python. And in some other cases, I'm going to use other programming languages. But fear not, because you can use Dapr with any kind of programming language and framework and actually operating system and runtime. And that's one of the strengths of Dapr. It's not related to a Microsoft stack. It's not related to any particular programming language. Of course, I need to use a programming language, right? That's why I decide to use C#. But of course, I can jump into different programming languages throughout the rest of the show. And you should know the containerization process, the fundamentals of containers and Docker containers, Docker registries and how you can pull images and how they run in your computer, Maybe you know how to run a container by using the Docker CLI, Docker run and the name of the image and pass some flags and some parameters and so on. So that's needed, okay? That's needed. And if you feel that you need to strengthen your knowledge about containers and Docker, well, I think there's a lot of different shows here in CSharpCorner Live. And of course, in the internet as well. And finally, Kubernetes fundamentals, since Dapr is meant to be used alongside Kubernetes, is one of the options for running Dapr. It's not the only option, okay? However, I think you can get the most out of this training course if you fully master the Kubernetes fundamentals. You don't have to be a guru in Kubernetes, that's for sure. But at least you know how, pods and deployments and services and those primitive objects in Kubernetes work. I think that's needed to get the most out of this session and the rest of the show, okay? So that said, let's explain the software prerequisites. Of course, we need Dapr. Duh, right? Of course, we need Dapr. But don't worry, I'm going to show you how to install Dapr by using PowerShell and using the CLI. Actually, it's a very straightforward process. So don't worry, you need Dapr. That's actually the only requirement, to be honest with you. Of course, I'm going to use .NET, as I said before. That's why I'm going to use the .NET SDK, .NET 9 SDK. And of course, you can use other programming languages such as Python, which is fantastic and glorious for building any kind of applications. So whatever floats your boat, just take into account that I'm going to use .NET 9 and C# 13, okay? And Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code or any editor that you love and like, that's perfect. You can actually use Notepad if you want. And of course, that could be so strange if you decide to use Notepad, right? I think Visual Studio Code is perfect for any kind of application nowadays. But most of the time, I'm going to use Visual Studio, and I'm going to be jumping around Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. And finally, we need some way to... Hey, Deepak, how are you, brother? Hello. We need a way to send some requests and receive some responses through the HTTP protocol. That's why I suggest you install Postman or any other HTTP request and response processing tool, such as curl or Postman or whatever you like, okay? And this is because Dapr exposes some APIs that we can execute, that we can invoke to obtain information and tell things to Dapr. That's why we need to, most of the time, send those requests. Even though HTTP is only one of the options that we have in Dapr, that's the option that I'm going to be using most of the time. Okay, people. So this is session number 1, Introduction to Dapr. And let's talk about the challenges that we face in distributed applications. If you've been building this kind of solutions in the past, you know that there's a lot of different challenges that we need to solve, right? For instance, it's not your regular monolithic application, even though monolithic applications are perfect for most of the, in a lot of the scenarios, right? The thing about monolithic architecture and those kind of software solutions is that you have everything in place and it's so easy to communicate between components and it's so easy to instantiate objects and invoke those objects and their behaviors and so on. However, when you decide to use a distributed application, or maybe you are receiving this legacy code base, that was built by using a distributed application kind of architecture, those solutions are more complex, right? Since you no longer have those components in the same place, no in-prog communication, those are out of process communication. So you need to send some data through the wire to this other place. Maybe that's another server, or maybe that's another process in the same server, or who knows. The thing is that it's more complex, right? And because of that fact, we end up focusing more on infrastructure. We end up uh, focusing on how in the world I communicate from this server to this other server, right? And what are the configurations, or what is the IP address that I need to communicate to, and those kind of things. So there's a lot of distracting things when you decide to use this kind of solutions. And of course, when you build distributed applications, there's a lot of tools that you can use. However, most of the time, when you decide to create those solutions, I think most of the time, okay, you need to decide upfront your runtime and the programming language and the tools that you're going to use. So in some sense, you are constrained on your decisions when you continue with the project. So that's another challenge. And of course, runtimes, they don't always support all the different programming languages. That's related to the decisions that you have to make before and beforehand you start the project. It's not that you change the programming language in the middle of the project, right? That doesn't happen. So that's a challenge. And runtimes, some of them are not very portable. Some runtimes are constrained to a particular operating system and version or architecture. I mean, CPU architecture or whatnot. So that's another challenge. So challenges all over the place where when we decide to use a distributed application kind of software solution. And let's jump right into Dapr. So Dapr was created as a framework for solving most of those challenges that I'm talking about, okay? So Dapr is a portable, event-driven runtime for building distributed applications in the cloud. In the cloud, quote unquote, because of course you can run your Dapr solutions on premises. You can even run your Dapr solutions on your own computer. That's actually what we're gonna do in this show, okay? The thing about Dapr is that it's an event-driven runtime, okay? Event-driven runtime, and it's portable, it's open source, and you can actually participate in the community and in the project. They accept pull requests, and it's a very vibrant community. And it's now part of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It's actually a brand new project inside the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It was I'm accepted as what's the name of that when you pass different phases, and anyway, they are now part of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation in the top level. And the website is dapr.io. Actually, we can open up the browser and navigate to dapr.io just to see if I remember the adjective that I'm looking for. Anyway, this is dapr.io. This is the documentation, and this is the best place for obtaining the latest and greatest information about Dapr. Okay, so I'm gonna refer to this website most of the time when we discuss some things about Dapr. So that's the only learning resource that I'm gonna tell you about in terms of learning resources and documentation. Okay, so Dapr, what in the world is Dapr? Dapr is this framework that you install, okay, that you need to install, and it's like a buffet. When you go to a restaurant, right, you have, I don't know, beef, and you have salads, and you have soups, and you have desserts, and you have different places, and you stand up, grab your dish, and you serve in your dish whatever you like, right? So that's the same with Dapr. There's a lot of building blocks, like a buffet, and you select the building block or building blocks that you want in your application. The thing about those building blocks is that they are created with the best practices. Um, I'm going to talk about those building blocks later today. The thing is that Dapr includes, like, I think 10 or 12. I'm going to show you the list later today, okay? So consistent and portable. This is great because if you think about it, let's say that you have two services, you have two components in your application, and you need to send some messages between component A and component B. So I don't know, maybe you decide to use RabbitMQ, or maybe you decide to use, I don't know, Redis or any kind of message broker, right? And you send this message, and this other component receives the message and grabs the payload and does whatever is meant to do, right? However, in this other project or with this other team in your same company, maybe they're doing something similar in that different way. Maybe they're not using Redis, maybe they're using this other obscure message broker, or maybe they're using the same message broker, let's say RabbitMQ, but another different version. Or maybe they're using different syntax, or maybe different, different payloads. So that's inconsistent in that particular scenario because those two teams are doing things differently. And with Dapr, you can obtain consistency and portability since you are programming against this consistent and well created framework. And it's extensible in a sense that you can add some other concrete implementations of the building blocks. And you can use Dapr in any language or framework. I'm going to use, once again, I'm going to use .NET 9 and C# 13. But of course, you can use Dapr with any language or framework. It's platform agnostic and architecture agnostic as well. So you can run Dapr anywhere, in any place, in any kind of operating system. You can use Dapr with any programming language as long as that programming language can send HTTP requests and receive responses. I think that's it. That's the only requirement for Dapr, okay? That's it. Of course, there are some drawbacks when you use Dapr, such as network latency, since you have this extra process, okay? I'm not gonna lie to you. This is not magic. Dapr is running as a process somewhere, and it depends on the architecture that you decide to use. So Dapr is not free. It's not that all of a sudden everything works perfectly. However, you have this very little and very small network latency that you have to be aware of. But it's so small that, it's not something that you can be aware of or maybe worried about. But of course, for some scenarios, Dapr is a showstopper because of network latency. I don't know, maybe real-time processing of things, or maybe if you try to, I don't know, maybe in an IoT kind of solution where you are receiving streams of data that need to be processed massively in that particular software architecture, maybe Dapr is not a way to go. Who knows? But at the end of the day, there's some network latency that you should be aware of, okay? And Debugging and testing complexity, that's for sure, since you have this extra process that you are communicating to. And this extra process, you need to understand what's going on behind the scenes, right? So there's an extra complexity when building Dapr solutions. Okay, so Dapr history. First release was available in October 2019. It was announced in an Ignite event. I think it was Chicago. Anyway, who knows? Dapr is not new, right? So it has like 5-year history. And the first release was in October 2019, and then it was implemented as an open governance model in 2020. And then V1 release in February 2021. And on November 2021, Dapr joined the CNCF as an incubated project. And nowadays, actually, I think today is going to be released, or maybe throughout this week, Dapr 1.15. Okay, so this is perfect timing for us, friends, in this show, because we now have Dapr 1.15. It's going to be released in this week. There's going to be a lot of different shows and sessions about Dapr 1.15, and I'm going to show you different building blocks included in 1.15 in one of the sessions later in the show. Maybe, I don't know, maybe in session number 8, 9, or 10. The thing is that we have this new, greatest and latest version of Dapr. If you want to learn more about this latest release, you can go to the Dapr website. Remember, that is dapr.io. Okay, actually, if you go here, join the Dapr celebration, this is the place where I took that screenshot, and it's gonna be great, and it's gonna be glorious for the Dapr community, this latest version. Fantastic. So I was mentioning, hey, Dapr has some building blocks. What in the world is a building block, you may ask, right? Building block, it's like I don't know, it's so subjective. Okay, so building blocks, the way I like to explain building blocks is like abstract classes, okay? Abstract classes in object-oriented programming languages, you have an abstract class, and then you derive from that abstract class, and you obtain that functionality, right? You obtain that behavior from the abstract class. You are inheriting from the abstract class. So that is actually what's happening with the building blocks in Dapr. We have a buffet of different things that Dapr offers. You don't need to use all of them, right? You only need and you only take what you truly require. So as you can see here on the screen, we have different building blocks that solve different challenges and different things that we need to use and face in any kind of distributed application, such as service to service invocation, right? Even though service to service invocation let's say that we're using microservices, when you try to communicate between services, synchronous communication between services is like, okay, be careful, but it's not forbidden, okay? So sometimes it's perfectly acceptable to communicate between two services in a direct way. That said, that's why we need to, create this request and receive this response from this other service. The thing about that particular scenario is that you don't know where that other service that you're trying to communicate to is running, because there could be many instances. There could be many different um, instances deployed in a cluster, right? There could be many different replicas. That's the word that I was looking for, replicas. So which replica are you communicating to? Who knows, right? So the thing about the Dapr technology is that it's going to make it easy for you to communicate to one of those replicas when you're trying to communicate service to service. And yes, we have this comment. This session is every day or only one day, sir? Yes, it's going to be Monday each time. Thank you. Okay, cool. Other building block, publish and subscribe. Of course, I'm going to show you throughout the rest of the show most of them. Okay, we're going to see publish and subscribe, service to service communication, workflows, state management, bindings, actors, configuration, secrets. I think maybe jobs and the latest and greatest large language model chat completions building block that 1.15 has. Anyway, let's go back to the publish and subscribe. This is another scenario that Dapr includes, right? Let's say that you want to communicate between two services in a asynchronous way, not synchronous, but asynchronous. So Dapr has a building block for that. Okay, workflows for creating long-running processes, state management for storing things, bindings similar to what happens with Azure functions, in a sense that you have triggers and bindings, and you can respond automatically from events. The actor model that Dapr has, and so on and so on. Okay. So the thing about this slide, friends, is that we have this buffet of building blocks, and you can select the building block that you want and truly need in your software solution. Okay, so in addition to those building blocks, Dapr has some cross-cutting APIs that are implemented in some of those building blocks. So, for instance, resiliency. Resiliency in terms of what happens if I'm trying to communicate between service A to service B and something happens in the middle, right? Maybe the network gets disconnected or something. So Dapr includes some resiliency policies for retrying and backing off and opening some circuit breakers and so on, and some timeouts and stuff for resiliency purposes. That's something that comes baked into Dapr, which is fantastic. You don't have to worry about those resiliency policies. Observability. So whenever you are using Dapperized components and services, Dapr provides metrics, logs, and traces that you can send to some platforms for observability, such as, I don't know, Jaeger or Zipkin, for watching those traces and understanding how much time did it take for executing this particular request, or for completing this particular query. We have those this observability cross-cutting concern baked into Dapr. And finally, security in terms of encrypted communication. And this is mostly for communicating between services in Dapr, and some other security concerns that I'm going to talk about in this show. Okay, so let's talk about the concrete components, because if building blocks are like abstract classes, then of course we need a concrete class, right? That's the analogy from object-oriented programming. So let's say that we decide to use state management. the state management building block. The state management building block exposes some behavior for storing the state, reading the state, and basically that's it, or deleting something in the state, right? This is, with the state, I mean some small pieces of data that you need to store in the temporarily, right? This is not a full-blown database, okay? This is not a replacement for an ORM or something like the entity framework or something. This is just for storing small pieces of data. That's why the name is state management and not a full database management, okay? But of course, as we can see here on the screen, we have concrete implementations of those building blocks. For instance, the state management. So we have a concrete implementation for Redis. We have a complete implementation for Azure Cosmos DB, AWS DynamoDB, Firebase, Cassandra, and so on and so on. What happens here, friends, is that you are programming against an abstraction, right? And you don't worry about the particular way of communicating and connecting to that particular and concrete technology, right? Because if you think about it, if you want to, I don't know, maybe you want to use Redis. Let's see if I can go here to Dapr in action. I created this folder, right? .NET New console test, doesn't matter the name. This is just a regular .NET 9 application. This is a console application, right? Even if you don't use .NET, this is just a console application, okay? And in .NET, we have something named the NuGet packages. And let's say that I want to use Redis. And this is one of the things that you need to do. You need to add the Redis package to your project, right? And then just continue programming against that particular technology, right? And the same happens with Python. Maybe you want to install with PIP, Redis, and so on, and with any other programming language. What I'm saying here is that when you decide to use a concrete technology, you are constrained on that particular technology and syntax and idiom, right? And way of thinking. But with Dapr, you don't, because you are programming against this abstraction instead of programming against this particular and concrete technology, right? And I'm going to show you that later in the show. Just remember different concrete implementations of building blocks. Okay, let's talk about the Dapr architecture. We have building blocks, and Dapr exposes APIs, right, through HTTP or gRPC. It depends on your particular taste or requirements. Most of the time, I'm going to use HTTP. And Dapr exposes those endpoints that you can actually invoke directly from your applications, or you can use some kind of SDK for communicating to those endpoints. You can use the .NET SDK, Node, Go, PHP, Java, etc., right? Or maybe you're using any other obscure programming language. And as long as it supports HTTP, requests and responses, or gRPC, that's the only requirement. You can use that programming language. And in terms of the infrastructure, you can run Dapr anywhere, on-premises, Azure, AWS, Google Cloud Platform, Alibaba, or so on, or whatever floats your boat, okay? So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, okay? That's one of the strengths of Dapr. Okay, cool. Dapr is meant to be used as a sidecar container, okay? Sidecar containers is this design pattern that we use for containers Um, and this comes from the containerization and containers and Docker world, um, and Kubernetes world. The thing about sidecar containers is that they run alongside your main application. So Cesar Cruz, Dapr is like Spring Cloud or Aspire. I think no. I mean, you can use Dapr alongside those two technologies. Just think about Dapr as a framework for building distributed applications. And bear with me, my friend. This is going to be clear and more clear um, as long as we continue with the course, okay? Though Dapr is similar, not different, similar. Okay, coming back to the sidecar thing, sidecar is this design pattern is running alongside the main application, and the sidecar is giving you additional behavior and additional powers, right, to your main application. It's giving you additional uh, functionality to the main program. So that is how Dapr is meant to be used as a sidecar container in Kubernetes, running in the same pod. You have two containers, the sidecar container and the application container. Those two containers running in the same pod, but don't worry about Kubernetes and deployment and so on. I'm gonna show you this in the deployment session later in this show. The thing about the Dapr sidecar is that your application, this is important, the arrows that we have here in the screen, friends, okay? The application, as you can see here, is communicating to the Dapr process or sidecar, right? It's communicating to the Dapr sidecar, and the Dapr sidecar is the one responsible for communicating to the concrete implementation of those technologies. This is important. This is actually what's going on behind scenes. You don't need to worry about, programming against Redis or RabbitMQ or Azure Cosmos DB or DynamoDB. You only program against those abstractions, right? So somebody was comparing Dapr with Spring Cloud or Aspire, but I think Dapr is similar to the that's an old technology and an ancient framework, but maybe somebody remembers the enterprise building blocks. The enterprise, what was the name of that technology from Microsoft? The enterprise, yeah, I think enterprise building blocks. Just a framework, just a set of abstractions that you could configure out from outside your application, so you can change the behavior of the application just by changing the configuration, but you don't change the code. You don't change the implementation that you have in the inside. Okay, so that's another analogy of Dapr. Here's another example, friends, of the Dapr sidecar. This is for the service-to-service communication, okay? Just think about this scenario, right? Just imagine that we have this application here, right? Let me open up Visual Studio Code right here. And let's say that I need to, invoke something from service B. This is service A, okay? And I need to invoke something from service B. So most of the time you do something like, of course, I'm not gonna use the best practices here, but you use something like client new HTTP client, right? Client get async, get a stream or get string async or whatever floats your boat, right? And here you pass the URL and you receive the response. Var response equals await and so on. The thing about this line of code, line number 4, is that you don't know this URL beforehand. And if you do, you don't have a truly well-created distributed application because you are hard coding those IP addresses, right? So you need a way um, to communicate between service A and service B. And of course, service B could have many different replicas. So in this particular example, the Dapr sidecar from service A is going to communicate to the Dapr sidecar of service B. And those two sidecar containers are going to communicate between themselves. There's no communication between service A and service B. This is the gist of this diagram, right? And of course, if you have many replicas, and I'm going to talk about later in this show, when you are communicating between services, you can also use an external name resolution component, such as, I don't know, HashiCorp console. That is a directory of those different instances that are running in your solution, right? Dapr has its own. You don't need to install console or any additional third-party component, but it's feasible here, okay? The thing and the gist of this diagram is that those Dapr containers are communicating between each other. You don't worry about this direct communication between service A and service B. You just let those Dapr sidecars to communicate and do their things. That is fantastic, right? How is it different to Azure Service Bus? Well, actually, this is so different, my friend, from Azure Service Bus. So I'm just discussing one single building block here, my friend. Okay. So with Azure Service Bus, maybe you can use the Azure Service Bus with this particular building block, but Dapr is greater than that. It's larger. There's a lot of different building blocks. Okay. And bear with me, it's going to be clearer and clearer as long as we continue with the course. Anyway, this comes from the Kubernetes Fundamentals training course that I did 1 year ago here in CSharpCorner Live. Just remember the sidecar is running in the same pod, and they can share networking and they can share resources. And I'm going to return to this particular diagram when we discuss Dapr deployments in Kubernetes. Okay? We're going to deploy our Dapr solutions into Kubernetes in one of the sessions. Just bear with me. This particular code, it doesn't matter right now. Just a reminder for all of you who are using Kubernetes nowadays, just remember that a sidecar container is running in the same pod as the first container, as the main container. Okay, let's talk about the Dapr anatomy. Anatomy in terms of what are the different hosting modes that we have and some other components that we have in Dapr and so on. So I think this is perfect for the last topic of the session today. Hosting modes. As you can see here on the screen, we have the standalone process. This is the one that we use when we are building Dapr solutions. Okay, you install the Dapr runtime, you install Dapr in your own computer, and it's going to run as a process. For instance, I'm running Windows 11, and if I run Dapr, we can see Dapr.exe. Actually, that is the name of the CLI. That we can see Dapr.d.exe as the process that is running in my machine. Another option is Kubernetes. As I mentioned before, this is going to run as a container in the same pod. As a sidecar container, remember that that's a design pattern for containerized applications. And that is actually how Dapr was created and meant to be used. And there's another option for running Dapr as a single process in a server, and all of the services using the same process. I think that's for testing purposes only. And I'm going to talk about in the deployment session. And finally, we can use the serverless flavor of Dapr that is baked into Azure Container Apps, which is a fantastic, fantastic, and glorious uh, service in Azure for running containerized applications. And it supports Dapr out of the box. Um, and you can think about Azure Container Apps as a serverless flavor of Kubernetes. Since we have Azure Kubernetes Service in Azure, similar to Elastic Kubernetes Service that we have in AWS, but of course, those two options, you need to have the skills and the technical uh, knowledge for managing and operating the cluster. And Azure Container Apps, you can think about that as a serverless flavor of Azure Kubernetes Service. Okay, so Dapr, when you install this thing, um, it includes different tools and components. Okay, Dapr is this framework. Remember, it's a framework. That's why it includes components and tools. Let's start with the CLI. This is the cross-platform CLI that we use most of the time for running and configuring and managing the applications that we have running in Dapr. It's like any other Dapr. I'm sorry, just like any other CLI. Dapr.exe. This is the one. Okay, Dapr. So I have version 1.14, and I'm going to show you how to install this later today. We also have the API that I mentioned before. Dapr exposes some APIs, HTTP or gRPC for interacting with Dapr. It also includes the runtime, which is the heart of Dapr. And I mentioned the hosting options, such as the standalone, sidecar in Kubernetes, and so on. It also includes some components specifically created for Kubernetes, such as the operator and the sidecar injector. So those two are used when you run Dapr inside Kubernetes. Okay, so uh, in the first sessions of this show, we're not going to use those operator and sidecar injectors. Don't worry about those. Actually, the placement service as well. This is for the actor building block. If you're going to use the actor model, that's when you use the placement service and you need to worry about that. So operator, sidecar injector, and placement service, we're not going to use those in the first sessions of this show. Of course, we're going to use them in the deployment and the actors sessions, respectively. And the Sentry is for issuing and managing mutual TLS certificates when you want to communicate between services. This is an option that Dapr has for issuing certificates. This is for security reasons. So if you ask me, the CLI, the API, the runtime, and the host, of course, those first four options are the ones that we're going to talk about more and more over the rest of the course. So preparing your environment. Okay, cool. Let's get into it. This is .NET 9, right? We are living in .NET 9 world right now, friends. .NET 9, this is going to be my development environment. Of course, you can use Python and other programming languages. But of course, since I need to use some programming languages beforehand, I decided to use .NET 9 and C# 13. So, Docker. Okay, so the thing about Docker is that maybe you want to use Dapr in your own computer. And if you can run Docker Desktop that would be perfect, since you can easily switch between concrete implementations of those building blocks. And if you can't use Docker Desktop, there's an option for you that I'm going to mention after this slide. So don't worry. Docker Desktop is like it's a nice to have piece of software for building Dapr applications, but it's not completely required. Of course, we need the CLI and Visual Studio or some other code editor, right? Any other code editor. Whatever you like, friends, okay? Okay, so let's talk about installing the Dapr CLI. So as you can see, this is just a PowerShell command. This comes from the install the Dapr CLI documentation that we have here. Let me show you this. This navigated to docs.dapr.io, right? So you can navigate here, install the Dapr CLI. You have the option for installing Dapr in Linux and Windows and Mac OS. You can even download the binaries if you want. And of course, if I select Windows, which is my operating system that I have here, this is the command that I need to execute. This is a PowerShell command for downloading this script, and then it's going to execute the script, okay? So it's as easy as just copying this, okay, and executing this command in the terminal. Just be aware that you need administrator permissions. Here's another option. If you don't have administrator permissions, this option that says install without administrative rights. In my case, I do have administrative permissions. Let me go back here and paste this. So this is gonna, as you can see, download the CLI. Just take into account, this is just downloading the CLI, okay? And installing the CLI. At the end of this process, which is very fast, as you can see here on the screen, you're gonna have this Dapr folder in your C drive, okay? And inside this folder, you're gonna see dapr.exe. This is the CLI. So dapr.exe, okay? This is the CLI. And of course, you can invoke the CLI from any other folder because the path is going to be updated as well in your machine. So for instance, I can execute the Dapr CLI in any place in my file system, okay? So that's the first option that we need. So the Dapr CLI by itself is not very helpful, to be honest. We need to initialize Dapr somehow. What in the world is initialize Dapr? What's the meaning of initializing Dapr? So when you initialize Dapr, is that it's gonna download the runtime. It's gonna download and gonna pull the different Docker containers, the concrete implementations of a couple of building blocks in your Docker desktop instance. And it's going to create a new folder in your user folder. And actually, that's it. So let's execute this, okay? Just remember that I have Docker. That's why I can just say Dapr init. And it detects that I can do this, okay? So it's going to download the binaries. It's going to pull those container images, and it's going to configure my environment for using Dapr. What happens if you don't have Docker? So there's an option for you. Dapr init -- slim. So you can initialize Dapr with this option. And in this case, you're responsible for installing the concrete implementations of the building blocks. In other words, you're responsible for installing RabbitMQ, Redis, or whatnot, okay? Instead of just using the containers that are pulled immediately by the Dapr init option. Make sense? That's why I think Docker is a nice to have component in your development environment. But of course, I understand that not all computers support Docker desktop. So as you can see, this process is quite fast. It says, okay, Dapr D binary has been installed in this particular folder. This is great. And Dapr placement container is running, Dapr Redis, Dapr Zipkin, Dapr scheduler. Okay, so I can actually say this, Docker PS, this is the Docker CLI, right? Or I can go ahead and open my Docker desktop management tool and see that I have now Dapr Redis, that's the name of the container, right? Based on the Redis tag 6 image container, Zipkin, and Dapr, right? Those 4 were pulled 2 minutes ago. I already had those 2 that are on top. So this is perfect. That's why I was telling you, friends, Docker Desktop is a nice to have tool when you're using Dapr because of portability, and you can easily replace those containers with other versions without you requiring to, requiring you to uninstall everything and reinstall the applications. So this is perfect. Redis, Zipkin, placement, and scheduler, those are running. What else? In my user folder, there's a new folder named .dapr. So let's go here, .dapr. This is the place, my friends, where we can see all the different Dapr binaries that were installed. For instance, we can see this bin folder. In this bin folder, we can see the Dapr D, which is the process of Dapr, the dashboard that we're going to see in the next session, and some others that are inside this web folder, right? All the binaries are there. Then we have the components folder. In this components folder, we're going to see some YAML files. Remember YAML? Remember that I told you that one of the prerequisites for this course is Kubernetes fundamentals. And of course, when we talk about Kubernetes, we need to understand YAML, right? And if you are a Kubernetes user, you can see that this is very similar to the manifests that we create for Kubernetes, right? We have the API version, we have kind, metadata, we have the spec. But instead of defining Kubernetes objects, Kubernetes primitive objects, we're defining Dapr objects. So component, right? And in this case, this is configuring, pops up. Okay, this is for configuring the building block of pub self for using Redis that is running in the Docker container. So let's go back here. You can see this other configuration for state store. And I'm sorry. This other one is for state Redis. This is the concrete implementation of the state management building block for using Redis. So as you can see, this is just passing the required configurations for connecting to Redis, which is the, when you install Dapr, this is the concrete implementation, but of course you can replace that. And I'm going to show you that in the next session. Finally, we have this other configuration, which is YAML. config.yaml. This is configuration, and this is for just configuring the observability platform that is going to be used in this Dapr installation. Okay. For instance, if I navigate to localhost 9411, we can see that this is Zipkin. Nothing fancy here, friends. I'm just invoking those containers that are running in my computer. And this is because Dapr was installed by using the Dapr CLI. So first, you download the CLI, and then you initialize Dapr, and Dapr is going to be sure to download and pull everything for you to start working with this technology. Cool. So this is it. This is it for today, friends. In the next session, we're going to continue understanding how to build Dapr applications. And if you want to follow along, just remember to download the CLI and install Dapr on your computer. Be sure to use Docker Desktop, and if you don't use Docker Desktop, be sure to use Dapr init double-slim. Perfect. So with that said, my name is Rodrigo, and I'm your host. This is Dapr in Action, and see you next week. Bye-bye.